our listeners today, and welcome to our first YouGovern Planning and Property podcast session. YouGovern stands for the Urban Governance Research Network and is an academic platform to build, share, and communicate research activities in the field of urban governance and planning. The platform was initiated by Professor Dr. Tuna Kok within the framework of her Chair of Urban Governance and Planning at the University of Amsterdam and is supported by a Center for Urban Studies seed grant, XL. The main aim of YouGovern is to connect academics, practitioners, and communities who work in the field of urban governance to create an interactive platform to discuss and collaborate research. As part of this platform, the Planning and Property chapter members initiate a variety of projects, including webinar series, podcasts, early career seminars, which is in collaboration with a wide range of academic, public, and property industry partners, open to participants and attendees worldwide. Chapter members explore the dynamic landscapes of urban governance in an increasingly property-led planning environment and discuss new ways of policymaking, planning, and urban development from a critical perspective. Herman, we are excited to have you join us today for our first podcast series and look forward to discussing the intersections between academia and professional practice within the property industry, focusing specifically on how graduate students can better prepare for industry practice and what the path from academia to industry was like for you. So welcome, Herman.
Thank you very much.
So I'll start by giving a short introduction before we get started on our topic. Dr. Herman J. Kok is a highly qualified academic and specialist in European real estate market trends, and currently holds the position of Vice President, Head of Research at Mark Capital Management in London, United Kingdom. Dr. Kok is a leading expert in European and international real estate capital flows and real estate development activities with connections to the academy and professional network. He bridges academic research with real estate market research experience and practice, which is vital to our session today on PhD professional research practice in the property industry. Dr. Kok has more than 20 years of experience as a professional researcher and represents Mark in international industry research communities such as the Urban Land Institute, the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, the European Council of Shopping Places, and is also aligned to the RICS regulations of integrity and ethics for business and research. So to give you an overview and our listeners, this session will cover three major themes. So first, we will start with the PhD process and early career transitions. Then we will move on to focus more on the technical skills that best equip future graduates within the property industry. Lastly, we will cover and explore your thoughts on what the future is like for PhD graduates in the property industry and how the lines between academic and professional practice continue to blur in today's industry. For the first theme of the podcast and our first set of questions, we wanted to zoom in on your background, Herman, and story, and look at how you found your place within the industry once you left academia. To start with our first question, what was it that propelled you to your first job after your PhD? And how did it relate to your research and past experiences?
Thank you, Mariam, for having me in this YouGovern session on career opportunities in the framework of academy and PhD research. Well, I mean, of course, how did I get propelled in my postgraduate, post-PhD career? Of course, there was some focus, but also a lot of coincidences. I think, first of all, the fact that I started a PhD was probably already a coincidence in itself. When I was studying in the university and doing my master's, initially I was actually not very focused on an idea of doing a PhD until, let's say, one of the professors I was working with, he basically hinted, well, Herman, it would be a good idea for you to do a PhD. Why don't you think about it? Initially, I was not really interested in that, but okay, gave it a thought. Then also an announcement got into one of the newspapers for a PhD position, a possibility to apply at the University of Utrecht, which was a project on residential market dynamics in Central Europe. Talking early 1990s, when Central Europe basically just underwent a transformation from centrally led economies to market led economies. I was in those days traveling quite a bit there. So obviously that was a was a very interesting opportunity. And I basically got the position. I got the research position, also with the premises that, okay, I would do that for 4 years. And I was not aiming for an academic career afterwards. That's also what I also indicated in the application interview. I said, well, my purpose is to do a PhD. My purpose is to learn more, but the PhD should make me also ready for a career outside the academy. The PhD project itself on the residential market was quite suitable for that. It was a high degree of explorative research. There was a practical component in there. I would say it was not, let's say, too overtly theoretical. So, of course, times passed. 4 years came to an end. And then there was, I would say, again, a coincidence. There was a job advertisement, again, in a newspaper. I didn't see too much Dutch newspapers, but that was about a real estate consultancy job with a possible position in Warsaw. And that was a Rotterdam-based company, Colpron, named Colpron in those days. And they had offices in Warsaw, Prague, and also in Budapest. So obviously, I thought, okay, let's apply. And in the letter and in the CV, I indicated that I was, of course, for my PhD doing quite a bit of work in Poland, but also a lot of work in Hungary. And, let's say a few interviews. And then the final interview, suddenly I was sitting basically with my future boss in Rotterdam, but also the director of the Hungarian office. And that basically led to the discussion that, I would basically start working right after finishing the PhD. I'm now talking autumn 1997. I would start in Budapest as a real estate consultant. Of course, the PhD had a strong focus on residential, but, obviously as a consultant in the market, you are dependent, first of all, what kind of jobs are being asked for. And secondly, also looking to the company, what kind of skills were there, what kind of skills were not there. And actually, I was introduced to possibilities to do a few retail-related jobs. So obviously, that was, again, I would say coincidental. But, even today, retail real estate is still a major part of my job. Then, of course, okay, how did it relate to your research and past experience? I think quite a bit. Of course, that's the advantage of geography and planning. It's a very wide topic. You can actually geography. You're a little bit in between economics, sociology, political sciences. There are a lot of different components there where geographers also take a little bit their share. And also my research, obviously with the focus on Central Europe and also quite practically focused, it really helped me to work very easily, let's say, with research sources, statistical data, and other things in the local Hungarian market, basically enabling me my job. So although, of course, a PhD is a long-term research, it's a single-focused project, it is to lead to a title, and consultancy jobs are merely short-term projects, basically focused on understanding the question of the client and answering them in a proper way, and obviously less theoretical. I would say that my PhD has been proven of enormous value for those first steps in my career. And although there was a high level of coincidence in that, actually the pieces fitted quite nicely in the frame.
Just maybe rewinding a little bit back to the start of your PhD, how did the interest in Central Europe start? Was that something that was part of the PhD position, or were you already interested in studying that region specifically?
Well, during my studies geography in Groningen, I was an active member of the Student Association for International Affairs. That was basically a club of students, a group of students, and basically interested in foreign policy issues, in trends in countries, etc. Within that association, there were different working groups on, for instance, European integration, but also Central Europe, etc. So we did a lot of activities there, and a few of those activities brought me with student exchange programs to Poland. Already during the communist times with family, we have been traveling to Central Europe a few times, so I had some basic understanding of the region, how it also was before the changes. But of course, during student life, we had those exchange programs. I did a master project in the former Eastern Germany just after the reunification on a tourism advisory project in the north of in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, the city of Schwerin. So obviously that region I found interesting, went there occasionally, Obviously, from a political point of view, very interesting, but also, traveling there. It was, of course, in those days very cheap. Life for, let's say, a Dutch student in that region, I would say, in those days was very good. So there were different reasons why I was simply interested. And then, of course, when the PhD project came up, my limited experience I had in that region at that time helped me to get that job.
It's really interesting to find out that you kind of had these, I guess, pieces of inspiration really maybe in, I guess, the middle of your bachelor that are really drawing you to starting the PhD with like exposure to foreign relations and traveling to other parts of Europe. It's not just this, I guess, a very single decision. It's more like all these different elements coming together.
Absolutely. And of course, I mean, it's now, of course, it's a long time ago, but simply, basically the moment, let's say, that the Iron Curtain was cut through, that the wall came down, and that region basically, became accessible to us and became connected to Western Europe. Of course, that was a major opportunity in those days.
Could you tell us about the challenges, maybe also bringing together working in that region versus from your life in the Netherlands, growing up there, and also about the challenges and opportunities, what it was like at the beginning to jump from doctoral studies to the real estate development and research sector?
Well, I mean, of course, it was quite a change, although, of course, I was lucky that during my PhD, I already spent a lot of time in both Hungary and in Poland. Of course, coming from the Netherlands, let's say a highly organized country, well-structured, also, let's say, of course, in international respect, well-capitalized universities. Going, of course, to Central Europe was really quite a different thing. On the one hand, things were very easy there. On the other hand, of course, you had to adapt, particularly in those times, that institutions had low budgets. The economies, of course, in those days were much weaker than they are today. So you had to contribute. So, for instance, to get in local universities in Central Europe, to get basically a workplace that you could conduct the research. On the one hand, it was very easy. It was just an informal one-to-one decision. I would say, almost taken overnight. People were very welcoming, very helpful. On the other hand, of course, the luxury, let's say, fully equipped universities, as we are having in the Netherlands, that was in those days, in those institutes, of course, more difficult. In Budapest, for instance, I really made the people happy by bringing packages of printing paper with me and stuff like that. That was the situation there in those days. But of course, if you adapted, if you basically went with the flow and you worked with the people, it worked all, I have to say, very well. And my times in Budapest and Warsaw, I can say I have only very good memories to there. And of course, that also allowed me to really get into my PhD research. Then, of course, the step from let's say, the PhD job to, let's say, the professional job in Budapest at the consultancy company, although that was a very small company, there were only 2 persons who were working there. I came there as a kind of Dutch, let's say, outpost, mainly serving international clients. It was not a very institutional environment, but on the other hand, it was informal. There was very much direct contact, etc. But you had to improvise. Things were, you had to organize things yourself. You had to find your way. You had to be flexible, and you had to adapt. And as long as that worked, and you were open to that, that went actually pretty well. But all the typical dreams, that you are graduated and you get a professional job and all, let's say, the status and amenities coming with it. No, you really had to build it up there yourself. And I have to say, my learning experience there was again very positive. And of course, particularly focusing on Hungary, you had to learn a bit of the language. You had to learn the culture to understand what was happening there, and also to be able to work together with the local people. Because in Hungary, in Budapest itself, I mainly worked with local people, and that, of course, was a fascinating experience.
So I guess an underlying theme I'm seeing is that to work internationally, and that includes in the property industry, you really have to want to work with other people of other backgrounds and cultures and be willing to, I guess, to maybe not take some risks, but like moving somewhere and learning a language that's I think it's something that we don't really expect especially when everything is in English now. So, but even would you say now it's something that you use? Like when you go to other countries, it's good to have a little bit of knowledge of culture and languages, not just what the real estate market is like.
In those days, it was really needed. I mean, even when going to the statistical library or going to institutions where you needed data from, where you needed information from, simply to get into the building, you had to be able to speak the local language, because language skills in those days, of course, I'm talking now mid-90s, second half 90s, language skills compared to today were very modest. So, of course, if you go to Budapest or Warsaw these days, you will notice that almost all professionals speak well English. Many of them speak also German. So, I mean, it has really internationalized a lot, but obviously, in the 90s, the times were different.
So that leads really well into our next theme for today, which is on skills that can equip graduates for the property industry. We went over how you transitioned from academia to industry, what drew you to the PhD process. Now we would like to talk about what skills you feel that current graduates can work to improve within their studies and research, and how that can eventually link to professional practice. For myself, I'm also a PhD candidate and researcher in the realm of real estate development and investment. And I often find there is a disconnect between academia and my workplace environment, especially because I'm coming from an urban planning background. So it's how can we bridge urban planning and property development practice, as well as academic skills, to skills needed in the workplace. I also find that a lot of the learning in the industry is experiential and mentorship based, but I believe that there are ways we can also link these two parts together better when we're transitioning from school to the workplace. To what extent did academia prepare you for those skills, and what kind of things did you have to learn on the job, and how did those skills evolve throughout your career? For example, today, prop tech is quickly rising. Data science is becoming more of a standard practice. There's a lot of software systems and databases that we're being introduced to. Could you comment on how academia prepared you and also that skill evolution?
Maybe the two main things, and then I will elaborate. I think, first of all, looking back to my academic history, both the master and PhD, I think, gave me a good ticket to start my career and basically land in a proper way in my job. Secondly, learning never stops. Part of the job is learning, because, now I'm talking, of course, let's say 20 years ago, who had heard about prop tech, about data sciences, about BI, Tableau, all that kind of stuff? Nobody had. So, you always have to learn, because the world is changing fast. And as an analytical, research-oriented person, you want to be part of it. Otherwise, you will be pushed out. That's as simple as that. What was my ticket from the academy getting into my career? And of course, I graduated as a geographer, economic geographer. And I think it gave me good, let's say, the geographical skills in terms, of assessing space, assessing location, assessing situation, particularly, of course, looking to retail real estate, but also real estate in general. Location and space dynamics, and how do you handle that? That's a key element of the business. And of course, it's very qualitative knowledge, but I noticed that a lot of non-geographers do basically have a very limited sense of understanding of location and space. So that has been very helpful. Secondly, I would say statistics, how to handle data, how to handle sources. Again, sounds very obvious, but not everybody, let's say, and that's a key advantage of also geography planning. Not everybody is able to handle that. That has been very helpful. Key feature of my PhD was also comparing different systems, different countries. So comparative research. And I would say, for me, that was a key starting point of starting, let's say, cross-border, international comparative research, basically being able to assess different situations and compare them at high speed. And fourth, obviously, and that's very generic, basically translating a problem into a relevant question. Make sure that is also the question your client, your stakeholder, whoever you work with, that's actually the question those persons intend to ask, and then come up with, let's say, proper conclusions and recommendations. And I would say doing a PhD and doing academic research, being forced in a framework that you have to structure that kind of elements, has been tremendously helpful during my career.
So to follow up on that, what I'm seeing is that those qualitative skills and ways of thinking, and also understanding processes and maps, and to what extent do things relate to each other, is just as important, if not maybe more, than the quantitative.
Well, it's the mix. And real estate, of course, is multidisciplinary. You need them all. Already in my research practice, you need both, because obviously, you have to be able to build up your thesis in a quantitative way. But what I mean to say is that basically what I noticed in particularly, let's say, real estate investment, and dealing with analysts, and dealing basically with people, of course, who see real estate as an asset class, which is to generate a yield and to generate a return. Obviously, whether that real estate is able to make that return, obviously that is linked to the quality of the real estate, quality of the prospective tenant, whatever. But in most of the asset classes, location plays a crucial role. And what I found interesting to see is that, you have people, and those are very professional people, high-level people, who have a very limited understanding of location, and are sometimes really surprised why, for instance, an asset which, according to an Excel calculation, should be a very good asset, yielding a very good return, but because of a qualitative location element, which which is hard to quantify, that you come up to a conclusion. Okay, that's a nice Excel, nice calculation, but I don't believe it will work. And of course, that in real estate, that kind of aspects always come together. And, when you talk about different business opportunities, it is also, the different aspects of real estate, you have to discuss. Because sometimes the location is the crucial variable, which will basically flip the thing. Sometimes you may have an excellent location, but there are other reasons or financial parameters or whatever that something cannot work. So you always need that confrontation between qualitative and quantitative, but also the confrontation between different disciplines in the business.
We could conclude that it's really that way to combine qualitative and quantitative data sources and reach a thoughtful conclusion is kind of what's the most valuable part of being a researcher. And that's also something, those skills are also something that will continue to evolve. As a researcher, we have to continue learning and adding new skills.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'd like to now ask about to your time working in the property industry. And now you have, I guess, in this part of your early career, you have a good understanding of working in the property industry, and you're, using both those skills from academia, have an understanding of what's available to you, what resources. Would you be able to share a favorite anecdote from one of your many site visits across Europe over the years, or also share your favorite part about visiting so many places as a geographer?
Yeah, no, I mean, of course, we have been visiting many different locations, and we have seen a lot of different projects. With a lot of anecdotes, of course. Maybe one of my favorite ones. One was basically we were working on an opportunity in Stockholm. That was a difficult opportunity, because on the one hand it was a kind of brownfield redevelopment, but there was also a component. Stockholm has rocks, so you have a lot of like parking garages, but also metro lines and so on, which are actually being drilled in rocks. So there was also kind of such a component was also part of the project. And of course, it was a project, it required commitment, etc. And we were talking with a lot of advisors And, you can sometimes be surprised on the spot. Serious advisors, obviously about market, about competition, about pipeline, what's going to happen, etc. And of course, everybody was saying, wow, there are no pipeline plans, nothing, etc. It's all, clean. We are not aware of any discussions. And literally, for us, of course, very good on time, but literally the next day on the way to the airport to go back home, there was a newspaper article that, a big developer was planning a huge shopping center about 2.5 kilometers away from the location we were looking at. And they announced it that they would simply build it. So a full surprise that mall was in the end built as Mall of Scandinavia. It's a very well-known shopping center. So, sometimes even when you talk to serious professional players in the market, you can still be surprised. Luckily enough, we were not committed to the project. But you always have to listen carefully. You always have to look twice. You always have to, read local sources, because this was a local newspaper message. And then maybe a second anecdote, because obviously when somebody is showing you a project or when somebody is showing you a site, it's a little bit like being a travel guide. When a travel guide tells you to see this and this and this, you don't see anything on the right because you look to the left. Now, of course, when you guide someone to a project, to a site, it's the way basically to manipulate, to organize how those people look at an asset. So, of course, my job for Multi was to assess sites, to assess locations. And I always, said, okay, I want, to see the things twice. So guided by, let's say, the guy who is promoting the site, but also with my own eyes, driving the car myself, understanding the traffic, understanding the directions. And once in Bucharest, I was also in a situation I had to do that. But of course, it was all a bit tricky. It was all a bit confidential, etc. So the guys brought me back to the airport in the departure hall so that I would fly back home. But then in the terminal itself, I took the escalators downstairs to the arrivals hall, rented the car, and did the exercise myself. Sometimes, you have to work in that way, because obviously, when you work with people, you cannot always say, well, but now I will do my own analysis, because they will always try to stick with you. And of course, do their own program, which of course, as an analyst, as a researcher, sometimes you simply have to go your own way to understand a given location, yes or no.
Yeah, I really like that anecdote. And I guess, so for my practice as a researcher, I notice a big difference between when you take a trip by yourself to do a site visit versus when you go with a whole team or with a colleague. Like you're, and especially when it's your first time seeing something, you're going to see it very differently, right?
Absolutely. If you go with a team, look, if you are going with your own team, then of course basically two sets of eyes see maybe 3 times as much. But if you are going also with, let's say, the vendor or the seller or whoever has an interest in you saying yes to a certain position, of course, that trip will be prepared. It's normal. I mean, when we were going with an investor to a site, we also knew exactly where we would land, how we would drive to a location, which route we would take, etc., etc. You prepare that kind of things. That's normal. It's part of the business. So it's also part of the business as a researcher when you have to establish yourself an independent opinion, that you have your own view.
So it's almost like you have to be a bit more, would pragmatic be the right word?
Yeah.
Instead of someone who's really selling, or
you have to be curious. You always have to be eager to know, hey, what's behind there?
So that wraps up, I guess, our second theme. And now we're going to fast forward a bit to what is the future like for PhD researchers. And so I found this allusion really interesting that you provided as a travel guide, as a very helpful way to think about as our future careers can be in real estate, especially because things seem to be globalizing very quickly. Transition to our third theme for today, which is on future opportunities for PhD researchers within the property industry. More and more, we are finding calls within academia to further engage with property market actors, investors, and developers who invest in our cities. And so we wanted to talk about this line between academia and practice and how it seems to be blurring more and more. Is this something that you've seen blur more and more in your 20 years or so career?
Absolutely. I think it's the connections are getting stronger. I think in that sense also for PhDs and then targeting for a career also in real estate, urban development. I think the times are, first of all, the sector is professionalizing and institutionalizing. And when you see, let's say, the game between investors, finance, developers, etc., I would say that these days you have almost no, let's say, serious real estate companies anymore without a research department, without access to data, etc. I would say knowledge, facts these days are fundamental if you want to make a business proposal, if you want to work on a project, if you want to sell that to an investor, if you want, for instance, to rent it to a retail tenant. Your stakeholders expect that, so companies anticipate on that. When I started with Multi in 2001, there was only one researcher working there, and I was the first PhD ever, starting to work for the company. So the guy who hired me gave me a 50% chance of success. Well, anyway, it worked out pretty well, but obviously that was a very different time. So I think that professionalization really helps. And then, of course, also the availability of wider availability of data licenses, data sources, within markets, between markets. Obviously, the capacity to analyze data, use them to build your case, they are much better than, let's say, 20 years ago. And I think also these days, if companies don't use those sources, then, that may even stakeholders think that, hey, are they a professional business? And I think that with the increasing trends of data sciences, data analytics, more data also becoming available for users, etc., this trend will only become stronger. And I think also when, for instance, also we look to affairs like ESG, like sustainability, circular development processes, again, the whole aspect of data, the whole aspect of facts, analysis, research will only get stronger.
Okay. And so regarding those data sources that are available and the analysis, you mean both quantitative and qualitative sources? It's not just financial data, it's all different kinds of data that we're getting.
Yes, it's basically, of course, there is a main pool of quantitative data on the economic side of the spectrum, like Oxford Economics, on the investment transaction side of the business, like RCA, Real Capital Analytics, CBRE, but also analytics, basically analysis, views, how to see trends. And you see that most of the sources on Green Street, for instance, is a particular one, that's available. And obviously that really also helps to build your case around. For instance, also in Mark Capital Management, the current company I'm working for, one of the aspects in the business, of course, is fundraising, is, let's say, raising capital, dealing with prospective investment partners. And of course, in the end, it's about trust. They need to have a good feeling about the projects we are working on. But let's say with their view on market trends, strategy, obviously, again, sources, how do you get to that view, critical importance.
And so what are, I guess, things that we can start? So you listed quite a number of sources we can start looking into, and also this balance between qualitative and quantitative research. But what are other things that PhD researchers can start focusing on to help bridge that transition to industry to prepare PhD grads for the market? What are, I guess, some of the steps that we can take now? And how can we connect to the market as early as possible?
Well, of course, these days to connect to the market, let's say relatively early, obviously there are good opportunities through organizations like Urban Land Institute, etc. You can have, as academics, you can have also with RICS, as academics, you can have interaction with market players. I think when looking to skills, we can be very detailed about that. But of course, how does the world look today? That's already a big gap with how the world looked like 5 years ago. And I'm very sure in 5 years' time, the world will again be very different, and probably there will be also different needs from the market, what skills are needed. But I think there are a few general things which basically are very important. First of all, a good, let's say, analytical base, simply to analyze problems, either quantitative, qualitative. I think that's a major skill. not everybody has. And of course, doing a PhD research, being able to go in depth, being able to analyze big sets of data or big sets of information, that's very helpful. To basically translate a problem, into, let's say, a relevant question, come with that, let's say, with conclusions and recommendations, and then translate it back into easy language, which basically non-research oriented people can understand and can implement in their business. So in other words, let's say also that differentiation between language, that's absolutely essential. And I think connecting, let's say, as a PhD student with the market in an early phase, that will help to handle that level difference. I think those are two main things. And then, of course, in also PhD, you often have to improvise. A question changes, something you want to research is not available, you have to adapt. Well, enjoy that and make sure that you learn out of that, because flexibility and speed are main, let's say, issues in the real estate business. Of course, a PhD in that sense has a very different purpose. You need to do an academic, theoretically well-founded research that has to lead to a PhD. Obviously, you have to be consistent and you are building a brick to the theory. Of course, when you work in, let's say, the private market, probably you're already aware of that, but when a question is being asked today, very often the answer is actually needed yesterday. So, basically the combination of in-depth, but also speed and flexibility, the sooner you get a grip on that, the better it is.
Almost, and I think you probably get this so much more, but sometimes I find when I'm asked questions in the workplace, it's like I'm already supposed to have the answer.
Absolutely. Yes.
But I have to first it's almost like you have to first teach yourself and then teach everyone else.
Absolutely. And sometimes you also have to manage expectations. Yeah? That's also important. For sometimes that's what I do in my company. And sometimes you simply have to present the people with the question for, okay, I can do, so to say, a quick and dirty answer, let's say today. But okay, if we are going to be a little bit more in depth and, you want to have a sound conclusion and you want to have a good go, then I need, let's say, X amount of time. I will have to work with those and those people. And I may need Y or Z kind of budget. So that, you often also have to come up with different scenarios, how to solve it. And of course, also related to that is always the question, why is the question being asked? Is that a question being asked because the guy has a problem? The person has a problem, doesn't know the answer, is looking for an answer, wants to proceed. Is the question asked because the person wants to convince someone else? What is, let's say, the position of the question being asked in the total process?
Okay, so it's also about, I guess, maybe you could say like knowing how to read people who are asking these questions, because they're not always clear on what those motivations are. And sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't.
Ideally, they are clear. And so when you ask the question, you get also quite a clear answer. But like in every organization, there are also sometimes politics at play. And then, of course, you have to taste the waters. When I was working for the development company Multi, there was, of course, you had a lot of directors, you had a lot of country directors, so everybody had a little bit their own territory. Of course, I was working for a lot of different people within the company, and basically all those different people could also approach me. But there was also a political component. Sometimes a question was being asked, and that I thought, okay, this is not a real question. This is a political stick, let's say. I have to bring an argument which that person is probably be able to hit someone else. And then, of course, I was very lucky. I had a boss within Multi who was basically almost like a spider in the web, understood the company perfectly and particularly knew also the people very well. And of course, he really helped me also to get a grip on the political process, to make sure that I could basically keep my objective and neutral balance within the organization. Because of course that was something I always had to safeguard very well. That's also within the current company. You have to be neutral and objective, particularly when it's about questions within the team.
Mm-hmm. To summarize this section here, we have a lot of opportunities as PhD researchers to transition from academia to professional practice. And a part of that is because the real estate industry itself has evolved. And a lot of these firms have professional research departments that we need experts who understand how location works and how geography works and how to apply it to different parts of business. And so, Herman, you mentioned a few organizations which can be a stepping stone, such as ULI or RICS, that can help bridge that gap and where we can start networking. And so, and they can show how we can get to the market as early as possible, because we have an idea that there is a role for us out there, and we can work to better bridge academia and industry. As a final question, is there something specifically to urban planning students, not just urban geography, but that may fit better? Because we have a more policy-oriented education and skills. So are urban planners more of a better fit with real estate investors, developers, consultants, or is it more something that's based on the researcher themselves?
Well, good question. The career practice in that sense in the market is in the end more hybrid than, let's say, the separation of urban planning and geography during, let's say, the academic times. What I mean to say is that after you have worked a few years and built up your career, whether you're a planner, whether you're a geographer, I can imagine that that distinguishment becomes a bit more vague. Simply depends on the direction your career is developing into. But coming back to urban planning, let's say when you got your master degree and when you got the PhD, I can imagine, obviously, within, let's say, the public sector, municipalities, cities, a lot of career opportunities, because obviously also with the real estate business professionalizing, we see the same thing happening basically on the local municipal and political side as well. If you look, for instance, to cities like Amsterdam, the amount of research they are doing, the amount of data they are producing, strategies and visions. And Amsterdam is not unique. It's the case for most of the large cities in Europe. Then, of course, consultants. Consultants, research companies. I would say urban planners. Obviously, having a good understanding of let's say, zoning, urban development principles, location, space, a lot of job, and then moving into the real estate business. And I think particularly those companies where there's, let's say, a redevelopment, repurpose, development, construction component in their business model, I think planning-oriented researchers are potentially very useful, simply to understand the planning system, to understand the zoning mechanisms, to understand, let's say, clear discussions, probabilities on where, let's say, rezoning, zoning changes have to occur. But in the real estate business in general, and also already partly with consultancy business, you will notice very quick that, let's say, the differentiation between disciplines is less absolute probably than it is within the academy. Because obviously you will work on a wider scope of projects. And that's what I also mean, that basically after a few years career, probably the disciplines will grow closer to each other. So, you will have to do a wider scope of projects and a wider scope of work. But I think for urban planners, there is a lot of opportunities, particularly where let's say, planning questions are relevant. Again, if I also look to our company, and particularly where we are active in repurposing projects, obviously urban planning is a key part of the business proposition. It's about zoning, it's about timing, it's about political discussions, etc., etc.
I think that's a great note to wrap up our last theme. Before we move into conclusion of our podcast, are there any extra tips or advice or anything that you'd like to add, Herman?
Well, general advice, be open-minded. I think that's very important. Doing a PhD, it can some people can have the risk of basically lock themselves down into a kind of study room, do the research, really be very focused on the project. Of course, that being focused on projects is important because you have to deliver in about 4 years. But look into the world, be open-minded, see what's happening around you. Indeed, that kind of networks and organizations. If you have a drive to move into real estate, Make sure, you can be connected to that kind of organizations. Most of those organizations have special fees also for students and academics. And also making the step, let's say, from a career from the academy to the practical world. Make sure, you get a chance to start somewhere. And a high chance that your focus, your orientation in the beginning will be quite different. But if you take it and you're able, let's say, to put in your experience and skills, then you will notice that as with a PhD, you're able to land very well. And thirdly, also realize that I think 20 years ago, that was still quite different. But I think in the business, people having a PhD in general are quite well respected.
Thank you, Herman, for all your time on today's podcast. Starting from your early career, we learned how the PhD increased your experience in the field that you were ultimately interested to pursue. Yet during that same time, you had to learn new skills and work with people of different backgrounds and even learn new languages along the way. On our second theme, you discussed in depth the skills that you acquired throughout your PhD and during your career with specific attention to the idea how skills are acquired over time and how you never stop learning within the industry. So for myself, I'm also currently working on my PhD. I found your conversation on the combination of qualitative and quantitative data sources, along with comparative methods, very helpful and practical. And I would also guess from my peers' work today, your anecdote on being a travel guide especially stands out and makes me think about how I could become a better tour guide while also taking holistic approaches to understand key real estate concepts and processes. And on our last topic, on the bridge between academia and industry, I found it interesting how you started with the topic of data and the different ways to understand data to make decisions and understand markets. So once again, mixed methods and comparative approaches seem to play really strong roles in understanding property markets and investment decisions. I also found your discussion on networks important, as both academia and the industry seem to rely on knowledge and even data that can be found within our professional and knowledge-based networks. And so whether it's managing your expectations or learning as you do, it was great to learn about the politics of the industry and how to navigate those challenges within the workplace. So for your final point on translation between either data, research, or language, this circles back to your beginning point in the podcast about learning how to interact with people with different backgrounds and knowledge. Overall, I found our conversation from this session very productive, and it was a great opportunity to learn more about your trajectory, but also to think about future opportunities and skills I would like to develop with my PhD. On that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you, Herman, for your insights and for advice on bridging academia and professional research practice. For our listeners, please check out ugovern.eu and ugovern on social media for more information about our research network and current initiatives. Once again, thank you for joining us for our session today, and we look forward to having you all listen in on our next uGovern podcast.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.